Les gens, les boxeurs comme style, c'est très agressif. Ils ont toujours ces t-shirts un peu à la Tyson, là, les shorts du cou, un petit peu.
When I say you must obey, just like the both of you touch my head.
Et là, Maïva, ce sont les deux.
Ouais, mais le crochet. Magnifique shot.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Et ouais, le crochet au foie, il a touché.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Pendant Bibois, encore un rouge.
Au corps.
Elle est dur là, qui a arrêté.
Oui, forcément, elle remet un genou au sol.
Et elle regarde son point.
With this, well, fresh off his victory over Badu Jack, a very close fight, hard-fought fight, Jean Pascal, the WBA's regular light heavyweight champion, had this to say. He says he's willing to face anyone. He never refuses any fight. And if you know anything about Jean Pascal, how his career has been over the years, in victory and defeat, a guy who's faced anyone from Badu Jack to Dmitry Bivol to Sergey Kovalev 2 times to later Alvarez to Carl Froch.
Bernard Hopkins 2 times.
There's a lot of truth in Jean Pascal's statement that, he doesn't turn down any fight because he's faced some very tough fighters over the years. Victory and defeat, that statement rings true. And 2019 was a very productive year for Jean Pascal to turn his career around when it seemed like it was all but over. At 37 years old, starts the year off by shocking Marcus Brown, the then undefeated top 10 contender. Marcus Brown moves into a Badu Jack fight, a seasoned veteran like himself.
Nixon.
Wins a close decision. I don't agree with the judges' scorecards. I don't, and maybe you don't either. But as it stands, that's another win in the win column for Jean Pascal. So what does he do now? Where does he go from here? In truth, I don't expect that Jean Pascal will shoot for a rematch with the WBA super champion, the full-fledged champion, Dmitry Bivol, because, he's already been there, done that, and I don't give him much of a shot of winning the rematch. I think the rematch would go the same way that the first fight did. I expect that Jean Pascal could see himself fighting the winner of Brown versus Barrera. That's a fight that might happen. That's a fight that might come off sometime this year, and I could very much see Jean Pascal fighting the winner of that fight. It being that Jean Pascal doesn't plan on rushing back into the ring, that at minimum he's going to take 4 months off to recuperate because he's not a 20-year-old, he's not a young guy, he's not the same guy that he used to be, and he needs that time off to heal before he's willing to accept any fight against anyone. In that time, we could see the Brown versus Barrera fight come off, and afterwards we could see Jean Pascal fighting the winner of that fight. Understand that I think it's admirable, the ambition of Jean Pascal, getting this second win for his career, breathing new life into it when it seemed like it was all but over. I think it's admirable, I think it's ambitious, but I don't have any illusions about it or him. At 37 years old,
43 professional bouts.
It's difficult to conjure that he could become a full-fledged champion. We know that these sanctioning bodies, these organizations, they're giving away belts, they're giving away trinkets the way people give out candy on Halloween to trick-or-treaters. They got a belt to accommodate every single promotional outfit out there so that their guys can call themselves champions of some kind. That's essentially what's going on. Simultaneously, it affords them the opportunity to charge all these different guys that are with all these different outfits sanctioning fees to keep a steady stream of income flowing. That's what's going on.
Yeah, pretty much.
But, Jean Pascal becoming a full-fledged champion doesn't seem like a feasible possibility to me because I see who he'd have to go through to do it, okay? The unified champion at the weight, Artur Beterbiev. Where you might go in there and you might be able to make things competitive against a Badu Jack or Shock, an up-and-comer in a Marcus Brown, Artur Beterbiev, you can forget about it. You go standing in front of that guy the way you were trying to stand in front of Badu Jack, and you're going to be in for a rude awakening. Artur Beterbiev has the kind of destructive, one-hitter-quitter power that can flatten most anyone, seasoned veteran, champion, or otherwise. Okay, we see what he did to Vozdik. Jean Pascal, for his best efforts and best intentions, I don't think, has any chance of winning any belt from Artur Beterbiev. He already tried to shoot your shot with Bivol, and we see how that worked out. You lost that fight, and it wasn't close. WBO title. Yeah, it's up for grabs right now, but it's within arm's reach of Zurdo Ramirez. They're very close to finalizing a deal that could see him contending for that world title. And I said this was going to happen. I said this before Canelo even vacated that belt. Hell, I said this before Canelo even won that belt, okay? For those of you that have been following this channel long enough. That Zurdo could be the next newly crowned champion at 175 pounds, and that pretty much closes the door for Jean Pascal. That is, unless he's willing to cross some streets to make some fights happen so that he can become a full-fledged champion as opposed to settling for being just a titleist, a guy holding a minor version of a title rather than a full one. I think that 2019 was very kind to Jean Pascal. It was a year that saw him being reintegrated into the top 10 ranked standings at a time when his career seemed all but over, you know? So he made the most of what he could last year, but I really don't think that he will have that same success in 2020. Not if he finds himself so confronted with one of the full-fledged champions at the weight. And just given the politics of boxing, the red tape that often holds up fights between different outfits, you know, it would require him to cross to certain sides of the street. And, you know, now he really is settled into the PBC side of things, isn't he? I mean, these are the cards that he's fighting on. It's not likely that he crosses the street for one of these other contenders or one of these full-fledged champions, because as we all know, all the full-fledged world titles really are on other sides of the street. So, you know, I think it was very ambitious of Jean Pascal to get back in the swing of things in 2019, though I have no illusions of what might happen in 2020. And just in keeping with the theme of news out of the light heavyweight division, Zurdo Ramirez, the former WBO champion at 168, now at 175, says he's very close to finalizing a deal for a world title, the WBO title that I mentioned earlier, and it will be against Salimov, as I discussed in a previous video. You know, since arriving at 175, Zurdo Ramirez has given his team a complete overhaul. Given his sparse activity in the previous year, most people might have forgotten or may not realize that Zurdo's got a new trainer. He parted ways with his longtime trainer, Hector Zipari, and he got rid of his manager, Jesus Zipari. He has since parted ways with the Ziparis, and he's got a new trainer, and apparently he's managing himself. Perhaps as an avenue to save some money, you know. Why give away a percentage of your earnings to some manager when you can manage to manage yourself? I think that's the hierarchy of thought, the rhyme and the reason for the split, or maybe there's more to it. Who knows? But at this point in the juncture, Zurdo has given his team a complete overhaul. Given the kind of fighter that Zurdo was in the super middleweight division, a mid-range to inside, close quarters combination guy, you know, guy who lets his hands go. Stylistically, you wonder that he may not give himself a complete overhaul there as well, because I'm not sold that that particular style of fighting, being an aggressive mid-range guy, I'm not sure that would bode well for Zurdo now that he's in the light heavyweight division. What worked for you at 168 may not work for you at 175, because these are bigger guys that dish out a bigger punch, and they're accustomed to taking one as well. You know, I wonder what kind of Zurdo are we going to see in the light heavyweight division, because as it stands, we've only seen him once in his debut, and that was against a journeyman in Tommy Carpensi. I've talked about it in the past. You wonder that Zurdo won't give himself an overhaul stylistically, as well as, you know, the business side of things.
Might have to.
I'll tell you that I think he needs one. It doesn't behoove anybody to be as greedy with their combinations in the light heavyweight division as Zurdo was in the super middleweight division. It's a whole nother ball game up there at 175 against those light heavyweights, and he might actually need a stylistic overhaul now that he's there.
Yeah, he might.
Now, as far as Zurdo potentially facing Salimov for the newly vacated WBO title, well, I'll reserve any criticisms of Zurdo until after the fight. I'll hold back because
the rankings,
you know, it's not up to Zurdo who the WBO ranks, where, and why. That's not up to him, and it just so happens that these are the two top-rated guys in their ranked standings. He has no control over that, and that in and of itself leaves a precedence for these two guys to fight for the newly vacated title. That's not on him. But what happens thereafter if he becomes a champion? That is on him. You know, Zurdo, I say it all the time, he had a relatively quiet reign in the super middleweight division. Now, some of that you can attribute to politics, that certain guys with certain belts were on other sides of the street, and they have strained relationships with Top Rank, the banner that Zurdo fights under. I've talked about this many times in the past. But that's not the situation here at 175. There are any variety of fighters on the top-ranked side of things that, have belts, and there are contenders, and there are just any variety of good fights with good fighters to go around for Zurdo. So he doesn't have the excuse at 175 that he had at 168. I will reserve any criticisms of Zurdo until after he procures the WBO title, provided that he does, because we don't know. It's boxing. Anything can happen. But if he does get the belt, it will be thereafter that pressure should be placed on Zurdo Ramirez to do something of note. Fight someone of note. Because as it stands, and I say it all the time, all he really did at 168, the most formidable guy that he fought was Jesse Hart, and that's really it. So I'm expecting more of Zurdo in 2020. And finally, some news of things to come in the welterweight division. Danny Garcia wants a Thurman rematch.
Why?
He never got over the loss, apparently. And in the article, he gives his reasons for why he wants the rematch. He let it be known he wants a Spence fight this year. He wants a Pacquiao fight this year. But he may also want a Keith Thurman rematch to avenge what was Danny Garcia's first professional loss. And in truth,
Could happen.
this may be a foreshadowing of things to come. PBC in 2020, what could be yet another pointless rematch that no one was asking for, similar to the Deontay Wilder and Luis Ortiz rematch that no one was asking for. It's entirely possible that this could happen.
That sucks.
We know that Danny Garcia is going to be in action very soon against Ivan Redkach, right? He's going to be in action soon against that guy. And the basic idea is that moving forward, he may either land a Pacquiao fight or an Errol Spence fight. Errol Spence, who says that he wants to come back this year without any tune-ups.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
Apparently he's saying he wants to go right back in there with the killers, all of that jazz, though I doubt it's going to happen that way. These guys can say what they want when you put a microphone in their face. Nobody's dumb. We know that some things are likelier than not to happen, and I'm not convinced that Danny Garcia is going to be Errol Spence's first fight after suffering that horrific car crash, rather subjecting himself to it by drinking and driving. Because lest we forget, if this guy's a victim of something, he's a victim of his own negligence.
He did it to himself.
But you'll notice the pool of names, the pool of options that Danny Garcia mentions by name. Errol Spence, Manny Pacquiao, Keith Thurman. You'd even do the dance with that guy for a second time. But what you won't do is prioritize a Terrence Crawford fight. That's right. As many times as we bring up the welterweight division, we're going to bring up Terrence Crawford because he's a part of it. It's the world of boxing, after all. Boxing is a global sport that encompasses all the fighters that are with all the outfits. And we're not going to limit what pool of options are there for Danny to just what the PBC's got when we know that Terrence Crawford is there. He's a world champion. You're telling me that you'd prioritize a Keith Thurman rematch over fighting for a world title against your nemesis from the amateur ranks, the guy you 1-1 with? The story goes. Danny won one fight, and Crawford won another. They could have the tiebreaker now that they're both professionals. But Danny, he always seems to have time for other things and has no time for that.
How convenient.
What kind of situation is it where one of the quote-unquote premier boxing champions doesn't place any priority on being a champion? If you rather have a Keith Thurman rematch more than a Terrence Crawford fight, you're effectively putting a world title opportunity on the back burner. And to do what exactly? Stage a fight that nobody was asking for? I remember the first fight. It ended up being more of a boxing match than a shootout. People expected that Keith Thurman was going to go in there and he was going to knock Danny's block off. Myself, I figured, Danny's got a chin. He's a kid who can take a punch, and he will lose, but he'll lose a points decision. That's what he did. Lost a points decision. And after the fight, there were a lot of people complaining because they felt that both guys didn't really take any chances in the fight, that the aesthetic of the fight was rather ho-hum from two guys who you expect more of. Danny's a puncher and so is Keith. Yet these guys had a very cerebral fight. As a result of this, the fight didn't get rave reviews, so you can imagine what the prospect of a rematch is going to garner. What kind of comments and criticisms are going to be associated with that? Nobody wants to see Garcia versus Thurman a second time. There's actually more intrigue, more interest in what would happen if you put one of Top Rank's best in there with one of the PBC's best at 147 pounds. At this point here today in 2020, there is far more sizzle with Crawford versus Garcia than Thurman versus Garcia 2. And I know that the first fight between Keith Thurman and Danny Garcia got some real good viewership. I mean, it really did. They got big ratings for that fight. But that's back when both of these guys were undefeated. That's back when the both of them were champions. Whereas here today, neither of them is holding a belt of any kind. So you'll excuse me for saying so that yesteryear's viewership doesn't give this fight a precedence here today to have a sequel. Nobody's asking for a rematch between Danny and Keith. I don't really think anybody wants to see a rematch. And God forbid that they try to stage this as a pay-per-view. I mean, I know it's not likely, but these days, you never really know until you know. I've no interest in a second fight. Do you guys?
Want to see that shit again?
Wouldn't you rather see either Keith Thurman or Danny Garcia fight Terrence Crawford? Wouldn't you rather see that? Wouldn't it be a world title opportunity for the both of them, whether Keith gets it or Danny gets it? That would be the chance for them to call themselves world champions yet again, instead of waiting around for the Manny Pacquiao sweepstakes. One of you already got it and dropped the ball, and the other one, well, he's still waiting in line.
Among others.
I mean, this is what the PBC stable of welterweights has been reduced to. Proposing potential rematches that no one asks for to skip out on fighting Terrence Crawford and continuing to pretend that he and his world title don't exist. As if they're somehow part of a different sport, different sports, because they're with different outfits. This could all be much ado about nothing, because Danny does actually stand a good chance of landing the Manny Pacquiao sweepstakes. I could very much see that being Manny Pacquiao's first fight of 2020, which would put any talks of fighting anybody else on the back burner. I just find it very revealing that Terrence Crawford's name doesn't appear anywhere on Danny Garcia's hit list. That before Danny Garcia even entertains locking horns against Terrence Crawford in the pro ranks, he'd sooner entertain a pointless rematch with Keith Thurman for no belt at all before he'd lock horns with Terrence Crawford. That seems to be where Danny Garcia's priorities lie. But I'll tell you something. Danny Garcia is a network free agent.
Among others.
He doesn't have an exclusivity deal with Fox. The same applies to a lot of the PBC's welterweights. These guys don't got exclusive network deals that would prevent them from fighting on another network. It's for this reason they seem to float from Showtime back over to Fox, back over to Showtime. Because they don't have exclusivity contracts. So if we're not seeing any kind of enthusiasm from a guy like Danny to fight a guy like Crawford, it's not because he's being held back by a network. He doesn't have an exclusive contract to a network. Put simply, if we see that Danny isn't talking about going over there and looking for smoke with Terrence Crawford, it's not because of contracts. It's simply because he don't want it. He don't want it. It's that simple.